all gun control is inherently racist or classist, whether it's intended to be or not. I recently did a video loading magazines sarcastically talking about how nobody on the left owns guns. And it was more just to make fun of the caricature the conservatives themselves have drawn about what the left is and then convince themselves that that's something that actually exists. That video had a pretty warm reception, but there were some people in there with some big feelings, as there always is. Before we go further, I want to make very clear that I don't really give a shit about gun control legislation for or against it, like personally. I definitely have some feelings about laws that are incredibly stupid, like suppressor laws and short barrel rifle laws and stuff like that. But my biggest issue is the political capital that gets wasted trying to pass gun control legislation that statistically will have little to no effect. But then it almost always inherently results in us losing elections and making us go backwards on everything else we've been fighting for. That's frustrating to me. I'm a pragmatist, and that's just fucking stupid. Before you go off of like Australia or whatever fill in the blank country, just please don't. There's lots of countries with high violent crime rates and stricter gun laws than us, like Jamaica and Honduras and the Bahamas. All of those countries with low violent crime rates have things like universal health care and college tuition, a bunch of social safety nets that mean people aren't living in poverty. What do you think the correlation is there? What do you think causes crime? If you need help, it's poverty. And if you don't believe me, just look up violent crime or homicide statistics, not shooting deaths, because that's kind of a specific cherry pick that doesn't really paint the picture we're looking to fix. Like, oh, the exact same amount of people got murdered, but shooting deaths went down, so we can count that as a win, right? Look at the violent crime or homicide trends of any one of those countries you want to fill in the blank on. Like Australia started declining after universal healthcare was passed. Or like the UK is just all over the board. Like there's no discernible trend with them for anything. It's like, oh, it's up now, it's down, it's up, it's down. No longer can you have a butter knife. It's still up. I don't know. It makes no sense over there. And even in the United States, the violent crime rate peaked in 1992 and then started a very consistent downward trend. 2 years later, the assault weapons ban was passed and that trend remained completely unchanged on its same trajectory down. 10 years after that, in 2004, the assault weapons ban expired. The AR instantly became the most popular firearm sold in America, and violent crime rates bottomed out a decade later in 2014. If you want to talk mass shootings, they're basically statistically unquantifiable because thankfully, despite them dominating our media, they are a relatively rare occurrence in the grand scheme of crime statistics. And I'm not saying that to downplay them at all. They're terrible and we need to address them, but I'm saying that as a statistical fact, they're just really hard to quantify. Because like going back to Australia, they basically had, very minimal mass shootings for all of history, and then they had the Port Royal shooting, passed a bunch of gun laws and went back to the same amount of mass shootings they basically had before. And then going back to banning ARs, you waste a bunch of political capital to ban a gun that's responsible for less than 0.5% of all gun deaths. And those gun deaths also include self-inflicted and accidental. Anyway, I've done videos on the stats, and if I get back into it, this will be a 20-minute long video about numbers that'll be super boring. The point is that I got this comment and a couple others to the same effect, saying that the only people who want mass civilian gun ownership are people who love tyranny and love watching kids and black people get shot, which is just fucking ridiculous on its face. I mean, just historically speaking, it's a lot harder to rule tyrannically over people who are armed. I'm just saying it's difficult to fight revolutions with pool noodles. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for violent revolution. I'm just saying it's a dumb comment. To add to the irony, I ended the fucking video with a quote from Karl fucking Marx about how the workers must be armed and any attempt to disarm them should be frustrated by force if necessary. Karl Marx, the communist. Communism is the opposite of tyranny, and a core tenet of it is stay strapped or get clapped. Anyway, I pointed out that all gun control is inherently racist and classist to this person, and they had some feelings. And then they called me ignorant and said it's obviously far easier to oppress and shoot minorities when they have guns. Sure, whatever. Obviously, Ronald Reagan disagreed when he banned open carry in California because the Black Panthers were using guns to literally not be shot and oppressed. But whatever, don't let history get in your fucking way. Now, before we go forward, I want to be very clear that if you support gun control, I am not calling you a racist. A lot of gun control is unintentionally racist. A lot of it, most of it throughout history was very intentionally racist, but a lot of it, especially today, is not done with racist intent. So let me explain, common sense gun control, right? Felons aren't allowed to own guns, which makes perfect sense, right? Why would we want criminals owning guns? And it continues to make sense so long as we ignore that felony convictions are kind of applied lopsidedly to certain more melanin demographics. If you tie a qualification or disqualification to an inherently racist system, which we all know our justice system is, that qualification or disqualification is inherently racist. And classist, because poor people of all races get convicted more than rich people. And it gets even worse. Did you know a marijuana conviction prohibits you from owning a gun? In fact, you don't even need to be convicted. Did you know a medical marijuana card prohibits you from owning a gun? But who do you think gets the brunt of most marijuana convictions? Now, I'm not advocating that people convicted of violent crimes be allowed to own weapons, not at all. I'm just pointing out that the system, as it's designed, is already inherently racist. And it's designed this way to keep the people who they don't want having guns, i.e. minorities, and they do it that way because they can't just legally be like, yeah, black people just aren't allowed to own guns, which they used to do. That used to be gun control back after the Civil War. And I want to point out too, while we're here, the Second Amendment is racist. The Second Amendment was specifically added to the Constitution to get slave states to join the Union in the Revolution, and they wanted that because they're like, hey, we need to personally have weapons on hand to quell slave revolts. results. See, objective reality and statistics rarely fit into anybody's confirmation bias. Okay, well, moving on. The felony thing is just one example, right? What about required licensing and background checks and insurance? Oh yeah, remember common sense until you remember it's all shit that costs money. Money, which is something traditionally poor people don't have on account of them being, poor, and putting in obstacles that have an outweighed effect on the poor is inherently classist, but also racist because minority communities have much higher rates of poverty. And then there's universal background checks, which is also, I think, confusing to some people because you can't just go in and buy a gun without a background check. If you buy a gun from any dealer, any licensed dealer, you have to get a background check. The loophole is a private party sale or a straw sale, but straw sales are already illegal. Private party sales, like me selling a gun to my dad or my friend, is the only legal way to sell or buy a gun without a background check. And again, take that for what you will. I don't really care. I'm not advocating for that specifically one way or the other. All I'm saying is that background checks reveal disqualifying criminal history that has an outweighed effect on low-income people and minorities. And I'm not saying that background checks are bad. Absolutely. We should be checking to make sure that we're not selling guns to the mentally ill or domestic abusers. But that still doesn't make it any less racist with our current system, and welcome to the world. Two things can be true. Then there's both state and federal Saturday night special laws. All those do is outlaw specific types of low-cost pistols that were popular with, you guessed it, poor minorities. But here's my point. There's a lot of feelings, understandably, when it comes to this topic, and I totally empathize and get that. But if we're going to be the facts over feelings crowd, we need to form our opinions and our policy based on those facts. The fact is that many of the people who advocate for gun control are doing it from a place of privilege. And that's because they won't personally be affected by it because they don't own guns, or they can afford whatever restrictions are put in place. Or they're lucky enough to be white enough to not have gotten arrested when they got caught smoking weed in high school. And then we need to be pragmatic and look at the cost benefit of where we spend our political capital. If our goal is to save lives and reduce violent crime, which I hope all of ours is, why don't we spend our political capital getting policy passed on the things that we know for a fact do that? Universal health care, affordable housing, making sure that everybody has food on their table, making sure that they can go to school and get an education. And it is an undeniable fact. You can stack any policy across the board, not even just gun control, any policy designed at reducing crime, and stack it against any one of those social policies, and those social policies will outperform it on every metric every time, as long as you know they're equitably instituted. And look, you can feel however you want about gun control. I'm not trying to change that or whatever. Like I said at the beginning, I don't care that much. The point I'm trying to make is just please recognize when it is in fact your feelings and not actually facts. That's all.